All right. Good afternoon. I think my sentiment is shared by others that at least for this period of time, that spring seems to be in the air, both not only the intellectual life, but also speaking of nature from our last panel, that nature is definitely compatible with the ideas being discussed. Before turning it over to our moderator, I just wanted to reiterate for those who are joining us now, welcome. And so we have two more panels this afternoon for the Democracy and Freedom Between Past and Future conference. We just had lunch, but if anyone has not had that, if they came in recently, there's still some things left over. So particularly between panels, if you want to return, you are welcome to that. And then also in terms of social media, and I think Mark he's wondering to what degree, is the idea that this should go viral or not? I'm not necessarily sure if that's the case, but in terms of the openness of knowledge, using the hashtag altogether Democracy Freedom Williams as a way to try and archive parts of the conversations that we're having today. And so I'll turn it over now to Mark Reinhardt, who is a professor of political science and American studies, among other areas here at the college.
Does that work? No, okay, I'll be really quick. In the spirit of the recent pop song, I propose chain to the algorithm as the hashtag that you use for this conference. So until a couple hours ago, I was supposed to introduce another panel, so I have no prepared elegant remarks for you. And given that, I see no reason to read aloud what you have all sitting in your laps, so I'd rather give the time to the panelists and our questions. So all I'm going to say is that our panel is Pluralism, Economy, and the Public Sphere, and I'm very happy at this amazing conference to introduce Victor Muniz-Fraticelli, Emily Nicole, and Deva Woodley. You can read their affiliations, their paper titles, you can hear it all. Let's leave time to talk.
I wanted to start by thanking Neil Roberts and the staff of Williams College for this invitation, which I'm going to use in a very selfish way to try to work out some responses to some of the objections that I've received to the thesis that I presented in my book around 4 years ago, The Structure of Pluralism. And I titled, when they asked me for a topic, I titled the topic Democracy and Pluralism because it was the widest possible topic that I could think of, because there were so many things that I wanted to talk about, and I didn't know exactly which one I would end up writing about. So I figured democracy and pluralism would be able to encompass almost any of them. Whether this encompasses any of the ones that I had originally in mind, I'm not sure, because what I'm going to try to do today is to start approaching the objections that I've received over the years and propose some steps towards a solution, even though I don't have a solution already. I don't have a solution because I haven't quite figured out on which side of the possible alternatives I fall. So I'll start with a brief outline of the claims that I made in The Structure of Pluralism, and the reason why I think they're especially important for democracy and freedom, even though neither democracy nor freedom really figured very prominently in the original formulation. And these are not just my claims, they're claims of a group of scholars who've been working on political and legal pluralism as a philosophical position. So some of these are shared with some others. Pluralism, I think that at first glance is a descriptive claim about the structure of the normative universe. It essentially says there is more than one thing of whatever normative fact we want to consider. Most pluralists are committed to a normative defense of diversity, institutional plurality, but I think the normative defense is actually a separate and distinguishable argument, which implies, but is not in turn implied by the descriptive account. At the most general level, pluralists urge that there are multiple bases of normativity, in the different domains of practical reason, so multiple bases of value if we're talking about metaethics, multiple bases of sovereignty or some kind of assertion of authority, the political basis, and multiple bases of legality in terms of legal pluralism. These are numerous independent sources of claims upon our conduct, and there are many incommensurable reasons arising out of these claims, and which lay claim to our identity, our subjective attachment, and our condition as moral agents. In the political domain, pluralism is the claim that there exists a number of claimants to sovereignty, or what sovereignty is the usual term. I've used other terms like meta-jurisdictional autonomy, which I borrow from Alan Buchanan, which is the authority not only to exercise political power over a certain domain, a territory, a population, but also to be able to determine the boundaries of that domain, or what the Germans called competence. In the legal domain, which is what I'll focus on today, the most pluralism is the claim that there exists a multiplicity of legal orders which simultaneously bear down upon individuals, or put a different way, structure their relationships, or at least their relationships of a certain kind, of a legal kind. And the central claim of pluralism here is that law is plural, that at any given moment a population is governed, or a sphere of human activity is constituted by more than one authoritative source of norms. These norms are of roughly similar type. They're all legal norms of some sort, and the sources are not arranged in a predetermined hierarchy of sources. So if you have, for instance, municipal law is generally understood as being hierarchically ordained under state or provincial law, which is hierarchically ordained under the central authority of law. If you have a very strong federalist system, you will have some claims that arise under federal claims that are not hierarchically subordinate to the claims of the center. So the idea here is that there's no pre-existing hierarchical structure. That means that one norm is always trumped by the other because of the hierarchical supremacy. And the sources can conflict because more than one of them may simultaneously lay claim to govern a specific sphere of human activity. Now, one might think that legal pluralism is a consequence of political pluralism, but I don't think this is necessarily the case, and I think it becomes important later on when dealing with the objections, because one may have a monistic political order that is in fact legally pluralistic. I think, although some people may contest this, but I think that the description of England before the fusion of the courts of common law and the courts of equity was a system that was politically monistic, the king was at the head, but legally pluralistic because the two legal orders in fact existed side by side, contested with each other, conflicted with each other in different ways. They subsisted independently. I think it's a little bit more difficult to make the case for a legally monistic system that is politically pluralistic, but maybe some forms of federalism or the separation of powers could qualify. Now, an important element of a pluralist legal order is that the authority of the different legal sources is jurisgenerative. To use Robert Cover's word, it produces legally recognizable norms that are part of an institutional normative order administered by a set of officials who claim the legitimate authority to coerce others into compliance, whatever coercion means. Now, not all groups exhibit this authority, not all groups claim this authority, at least when it comes to the Western liberal democratic tradition. The groups that claim this authority are kind of dialectical holdovers from the pre-modern world. They tend to be professional organizations, universities, churches, most importantly, cities in some case. Now, pluralism is agnostic about the merit of these claims to authority, but it's not agnostic about their status. They ought to be treated as what they are. If they meet whatever criteria applies to the state as a political or as a legal authority, then they are authorities as well. And stateness is not some kind of independent validating criterion. And the importance for political pluralism is more in what it denies than in what it affirms. It denies that necessarily the authority of some particular group is predominant or paramount. It denies essentially a kind of strong Republican vision. When it comes to legal pluralism, I think the importance is a little bit more technical because it merely means that legal techniques that are used to deal with different kinds of law can be applied to non-state legal orders and non-state legal norms in interesting ways. And these claims can be treated as law rather than simply as cultural norms, claims of conscience, associational rights, etc. I'm skipping over a number of things for the sake of time. Now, the objections that I've received, and I'm thinking of two people specifically, of Jean Cohen and Cécile Laborde, who've argued against what they call the jurisdictional pluralist claim. Steve Smith of University of San Diego is also one of the people who are within this group, as well as Rick Garnett and several other legal scholars who've pushed the vision of freedom of the church or strong associational autonomy of religious organizations in this context. So they have objected both to the descriptive and the prescriptive aspects of the account. And I'll focus merely on the prescriptive aspects here. I think the objections are of two different kinds. One of them holds that pluralism does too little, and the other holds that pluralism does too much. The first objection, that pluralism does too little, I will call the finality objection. And I think that Cécile Laborde makes an argument against it quite clearly in her book on liberalism's religion. She says, liberal democratic legitimacy presupposes the final authority of the state in solving what I have called the jurisdictional boundary question. Let me simply point out two pro tanto reasons in its favor. The first is the authoritative and stable resolution of conflicts about justice requires a final, ultimate source of sovereignty. The second consideration is that the democratic states are fitting sources of sovereignty because they represent the interest of individuals qua individuals, regardless of their contingent features, identities, and memberships. Individuals are members of a plurality of groups and associations, but their paramount interests as free and equal citizens must be represented by a universal membership association. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this objection simply because I think it rests on some question-begging premises, like the assumptions that individuals have paramount interests in free and equal citizenship, as opposed to, say, paramount interests in fellowship or salvation, or, for instance, that a state of 3 or 30 or 300 million is in fact more universal than a church of 1.3 billion. One of the reiterated theses of pluralism, not just my own, but I think all pluralist theses, is that there is no such thing as a paramount interest or a universal membership organization. And I've argued elsewhere that the attachment of individuals to the state is better understood instrumentally, and the authoritative and stable resolution of conflicts is in fact a product of negotiation and can rest on asymmetrical justification. The second objection, which I call the governance objection, bothers me more. One form of it was put to me by Jean Cohen at a workshop a few years ago, and it's haunted me since, in part because of some legal history research that I was undertaking at the time. Cohen confronted me with the unquestionable fact that legal pluralism is a characteristic colonial governance regime. Most colonial systems have operated through a system of subsidiary authorities, some of them that they have found, most that they have created or altered in order to serve as better instruments of governance. Free peoples in the republican tradition, free peoples are monistic. There is one law that governs all the citizens, and it is part of your status as a citizen that you are governed by this one law. And in fact, your aspiration, if you are not a citizen and are still fall under the purely coercive authority of the state, is very often to gain this citizenship. Civis Romanum sum saved Paul from being crucified and not Peter, because Peter was not a citizen. And the extension of citizenship to a broader and broader group of people within the Roman Empire was seen as freeing them in some way from the arbitrariness of the lex peregrinus, or the comparative law of their different personal jurisdictions. And there's plenty of comparative political theory and comparative politics that bear this out. Benton and Ross wrote that empires are layered legal arrangements with composite polities. Benton says, empires necessarily involved layer constructions of sovereignty while also producing patterns of legal pluralism that corresponded to, with varying degrees of precision, categories of cultural difference. Imperial officials gave sustained thought to such familiar problems as the relation of law and governance, the effects of legal pluralism on the production and control of revenue, and the regulation of distant and economic activities. The comparative study of legal pluralism in empires reveals repeating patterns across substantively very different legal orders. Now, the legal history research that I was doing at the time had to do with the change of attitudes in the United States between the American Declaration of Independence and the Spanish-American War of 1898. In the American War of Independence, the Declaration of Independence itself says, as one of its enumerated arguments for independence, that the Americans are seeking separation from Britain for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. Now, they were talking about Quebec, so this is very close to the kind of law that I teach and that I deal with in Quebec, the presence of civil law in Quebec as opposed to common law, the presence of a legally pluralistic regime. And lest we think that it's not really legally pluralistic, when a Quebec lawyer, even today, is analyzing a question and they don't find an answer in positive Quebec law, they will go to French and Spanish and Italian treatises rather than to, at least in the domain of private law, rather than, say, to judicial decisions on torts or contract law or family law in Ontario or Saskatchewan or Manitoba. The legal regime, although it's not politically independent, is nonetheless a separate legal tradition that is understood to find its legitimacy elsewhere. So the colonists objected to the Quebec Act of 1774, which granted toleration to Roman Catholicism in Quebec and the preservation of civil law in private law matters. Fast forward a few years, the United States in the Spanish-American War acquires 3 territories that, just like Quebec, are majority Catholic, completely civil law countries governed by property regimes that are different from the property regime present in the mainland. So what do? Well, you find that in the reports of the military governors, of Governor Davis in Puerto Rico, of Elihu Root, who was the Secretary of War, by the second or third page of the treatment of the legal regime that they're going to apply to the new colonies, they say, you know, the British did this great thing in 1774 with Quebec. They allowed for all the private law to remain within a different legal system, which did not disrupt the lives of the people who lived there, made the system nonetheless quite legible to the imperial authority, and this is a wonderful way to integrate politically, but not juridically, these countries into the American sphere. If you look at cartoons from the period, you will realize that this legal move corresponds with a crisis of conscience where many people in the United States are realizing that there is a distinctive turn with the incorporation, or rather the non-incorporation of these acquired territories, a distinctive turn from republic to empire. So the emergence of legal pluralism within the United States, which had previously been essentially restricted to Louisiana, and even there, well, at least we Puerto Rican civilians think that the Louisianas gave up the civilian ghost many years ago when they adopted the Uniform Commercial Code on the matter of sales, but that's an internal dispute. But even in Louisiana, there had been only a very small and very constrained level of pluralism. The wholesale adoption of legal pluralism makes sense for the United States in 1898 as it moves from a self-conceived, let's forget about effects and simply about self-conception, from a self-conceived Republican regime to what clearly became a much more openly, overtly, and unapologetically, if you read those reports from the Secretary of War and the military governors, a much more imperial regime in form as well as substance. So this objection haunts me in part because pluralism is generally understood, by pluralists at least, as being a source of freedom. The opening lines of Jacob Levy's Rationalism, Pluralism and Freedom say, free persons act together. They rightly seek the freedom to organize those groups they see fit, free from outside interference, and to live according to the rules and values of the groups to which they belong. This freedom protects their wishes to live and organize themselves, moreover, by providing alternatives to acting through the state and institutional resistance to expansions of state power. Such intermediate groups indirectly secure freedom more broadly, and they help to protect us against tyranny. So my concern here on the colonialist concern, or the governance concern, is that it points to a broader point, or it points to a broader claim that I think is actually an accurate claim about pluralism, that pluralism is about authority. It's methodologically about a shift towards authority, a methodological shift towards looking at authority as the fundamental category of legal and political order. This is especially true in most of the work that I do that has to do with church and state, where a pluralist approach moves you away from a freedom of conscience approach, which is very much an individual approach, to an approach about plural authority, which is a collective approach that looks at, say, the church as opposed to the individual religious objector. So pluralism is about authority, and the pluralist epics, if there are some, they feature serfs moving from country to city to be free, merchants shuffling between different customary regimes and systems of weights, ecclesiastics finding some kind of reprieve in the benefit of clergy. But these are not people who are finding themselves free in universality. They are people who are choosing between one authority and another authority and shifting between different claims upon them and not breaking away from them altogether. There's stories about moving between legal authorities and not escaping the claim altogether. So this shows that pluralism is about the recognition of multiple governances, but it is very much about governance, not about the escape from governability. So if pluralism finds a space for freedom, it's in the conflict between these different governance regimes, which proposes perhaps, and this is very sketchy because I haven't thought it through yet, but I think it proposes perhaps a solution to the colonialist objection. It involves both the biting of a bullet and the splitting of a hair. The biting of a bullet is something that I've been thinking about for quite some time, about the traditions of French liberal thought altogether, starting from Montesquieu through Constant and Tocqueville, and ending perhaps even in Foucault, if you understand Foucault as within that tradition, even if he breaks away from the liberal elements. And if you contrast Tocqueville and Foucault, a lot of their descriptions of governability and authority are quite similar. It's just that their normative conclusion on whether the sign should be positive or negative is different. So pluralism, I think, starts off in at least my pluralism, and here I think Jacob Levy's pluralism is more Foucauldian, but my pluralism, which is a much more Tocquevillian pluralism, argues that what pluralism allows is multiple places of governability because people need governability. People need to be governed. And therefore, having that governability split among different sources is better than having it concentrated. So that's the biting of the bullet. The splitting of the hair is that I think that the difference between political and legal pluralism allows for a difference from the colonialist objection, because colonialism is only a masked kind of pluralism. It's a pluralism that instrumentalizes the non-state regime and conscripts it into a governance for the political benefit of the empire. But strong legal pluralism, that legal pluralism rooted in the conflict between emperor and pope, the conflict between town and gown, argues that the political and the legal must reside in that authority that is outside of the state, just as they reside in the state authority as well. That the conflict between the two is both a political and a legal conflict at once. That contrary to the colonial arrangement, where legal pluralism is in the non-state legal order, but political authority remains at the center, legal and political pluralism have to be consolidated in order to present an effective space for freedom within a pluralist state. Thank you.
Right, can everyone hear me okay? All right. So as with everyone else, I'd like to start by thanking Neil for the invitation to be here. I'm really honored to be included and to be a part of this conversation and to have the chance to talk through some ideas that I've been thinking about with all of you. And also many thanks to Carrie and Veronica for making everything go so smoothly and so nicely while we've been here. So my talk for today is an effort to bridge two recent endeavors. The first is some research that I've been doing into early modern policy and political thinking on the problem of poverty and the construction of the poor as unruly subjects in the 17th and 18th centuries. So a fellow early modernist, and I also thought, why am I here? But I think I'm starting to understand why. And also the second experience was a hybrid undergraduate and graduate seminar on the politics of capitalism and political thinking, organized around the theme of labor as a core problem for capitalism. So I'm hoping to use this talk as a way of honoring some of the work that I did there with my smart students, who I was lucky to be with. So my main contention for the talk today is that the construction of the poor as a political category has been an ongoing project for centuries of Western political thinking, one that has almost always been linked to sharp anxieties about productivity and work as cornerstones of political membership and belonging. And I think this won't really be news to anyone here. One need only be a casual observer of debates surrounding social welfare policies and benefits to notice the ways in which the poor are frequent objects of moralization and anxiety, particularly around the question of their work. So in a February 2018 piece in the New York Times entitled "Who's Able-Bodied Anyway?", Margot Sanger-Katz and Emily Badger think about the category of able-bodied as a political term used to sort the so-called deserving from the so-called undeserving poor, a category that wields a dangerous power in determining eligibility for social programs and benefits. And they comment that in political discourse, the term, quote, able-bodied has retained its moral connotations, but lost much of its historical context, unquote. As they figure it, and these are their words, not mine, the term dates back 400 years when English lawmakers used it in the same way to separate poor people who were physically incapable of supporting themselves from the poor who ought to be able to. Debates over poverty in America today follow a direct line from that era, unquote. Today I won't trace that line, but I will talk about one piece of that context, and this is the English philosopher John Locke's efforts to insert himself into the national poor laws debates of post-1688 England. And my account will draw on the work of social historians who have documented micro-practices of poverty relief at the level of the English parish, and on political theorists who have read his 1697 policy memorandum on the poor laws. Some of you might be familiar with it or might teach it. Chief among these interpreters have been C.B. McPherson and Nancy Hirschman, both of whom argue that Locke's political thought, taken as a whole, reveals a story of class-based oppression. And my talk will be in sympathy with their work, but I'm going to focus more on labor and freedom and unfreedom than on class politics and class oppression per se. So my plan is to proceed in three stages. First, I'll just give a very truncated sketch of the early modern system of English poor relief, which was an object of debate in Locke's time. Second, I'll look at how Locke inserts himself into this debate by looking at this text in particular. And if I can take a page from Nick's book, I will be describing and interpreting, but not endorsing his position, and I feel I should say that from the outset. And then third, I'll suggest reading Locke on the poor should press us to think about labor, freedom, and political belonging in contemporary democratic politics. So I'll try to connect some of this work to the theme of the conference. All right, so part one, the brief sketch. There was a codified system of poor relief in England and Britain in the long 18th century, and it had been underway for some time at that point. The process of seeking relief in Locke's time was initiated by individuals who were in need of aid. That was how it began. So people thus self-identified as impoverished and made requests for aid from appointed overseers at the level of the parish, the smallest political unit in England at that time. And this aid could take several forms: food, supplies, money, or work. The funds that supported material poor relief came from the taxes paid by propertied members of the parish, and these same parishioners were also required to offer short-term or longer-term work to people who sought it. And poor relief at this time took what were called indoor and outdoor forms. Outdoor relief was mostly direct assistance, money, clothing, food, to be used at the discretion of the poor themselves. Indoor relief was the offer of particular kinds of work, and primarily it amounted to poor people being put to work in institutions, workhouses or working farms for adults and working schools for small children, which very strongly resembled workhouses, except they usually came with a rudimentary education and some meals. Although the poor laws themselves were stable, the system itself was highly variable because it was so localized. Different parishes had different practices and methods of distributing benefits, and some were more generous and better resourced than others. And this variation from parish to parish led to a lot of movement among the poor, as you might expect. They would travel some distances to more generous or better resourced parishes to request aid and receive assistance. In 1662, the Settlement Act, which was a modification of the existing poor laws, went into effect. And this particular piece of legislation required all residents of parishes to formally affiliate to their parishes, so that if they ever needed poor relief, everyone would know which parish should supply aid to them. And this piece of legislation did something else too. It restricted the movement of the poor. First, it made aid seeking outside of one's registered parish a punishable offense, and it also made movement difficult in other ways too. So to give one illustration of how it restricted movement in other ways, to declare residency or settlement in a new parish and to be eligible for benefits, you had to work there for a year and 1 day. And so people who were hiring poor migrants responded by shortening work cycles so that they could hire people for just long enough to get their labor, but not long enough to allow them to declare residency in the parish. So it changed the system of movement altogether. And this is roughly the system that Locke is analyzing in his memorandum to the English Board of Trade. Okay, part 2, what does Locke say? By the late 17th century, it was generally accepted that the poor had a right to relief in England and that this right was a legal entitlement. In spite of the established character of poor relief, this period also witnessed an open public debate about how the relief system itself might be regulated and modified, which frequently also amounted to asking the question of how the poor themselves might be regulated. And Locke enters the fray in 1697 in this memorandum, which he begins with a puzzle. And the puzzle that he uses to frame his engagement is this: how, in a time of relative prosperity for England, could what he calls the multiplying of the poor be explained? Locke's explanation for the rise of poverty and his recommendations for how it might be curbed end up resting on a single causal claim that he makes. That is, quote, "The growth of the poor must therefore have some cause, and it can be nothing else but the relaxation of discipline and corruption of manners, virtue and industry being as constant companions on the one side as vice and idleness are on the other." Close quote. Bless you. The poor have become, in Locke's view, and this is his language, a burden on the public due to their own corruption, and his purpose is to determine, quote, "proper methods for setting on work and employing the poor of this kingdom and making them useful to the public," unquote. From the outset then, Locke generates a pair of assertions that go on to frame the rest of his analysis: that the poor are a potentially useful source of labor to be exploited in the interest of creating a more productive England, as well as an idle, undisciplined drain on an already productive England. So this tension sits at the heart of his analysis, and these two claims meet in his argument that the solution to the problem of poverty is to make the poor work. Locke offers a detailed taxonomy of the impoverished, and he structures this taxonomy by an underlying question of desert. Who, among those who self-identify as poor, is deserving of public welfare relief? This is the question that structures his taxonomy. Locke divides the poor into 3 groups: people who cannot do anything to support themselves, people who cannot fully support themselves but can contribute to their own sustenance and survival, and people who can support themselves entirely by their own labor. And here, he links the poor person's capacity for productive labor with corresponding judgments of moral desert. Locke's first category, the unable to work and hence the deserving poor, in his estimation, includes those who are too chronically ill or disabled to work in any capacity. And he argues that if they have no relatives capable of providing care, then they are worthy of complete support by their local parishes through a system of poorhouses and alms in line with current practice. Locke's second category of the poor, those who can do some work towards their own sustenance, is likely the largest and most varied group in its makeup. And here he folds in many kinds of people. Adults who are, in his words, decayed from their full strength, unquote, but still capable of doing some work. The wives of day laborers who spend their time caring for children and hence have little unbroken time to work outside of the home. And these children themselves. While none can independently support themselves with their own labor power, Locke argues that what labor they can perform should not be, quote, wholly lost, which is so much loss to the public, close quote. As will become clear, Locke views all of these people as underused resources for increasing the productivity and welfare of the public. Locke's harshest moral judgment is reserved for the third class that I mentioned a few moments ago, those whom he thinks can support themselves entirely by their own labor. And he splits this group into two more specific categories. The first are people who have many children, quote, whom they cannot or pretend they cannot support by their labor, unquote, and, quote, those who pretend they cannot get work and so live only by begging or worse. Locke figures these individuals as begging drones, which is a recurring metaphor that he uses throughout the text, and he argues that they, quote, live unnecessarily upon other people's labor. His problem with them seems to be that they are not simply idle in his estimation. He also argues that they deceive and manipulate the public in their efforts to remain so. And this is a part of his moral condemnation. Locke's moralistic analysis of the poor opens very quickly into a proposal for the discipline and management of people who can be set to work. From the body of existing poor laws, he upholds the most punitive regulations while recommending some new approaches and techniques for administering poor relief. And these addenda that he offers paint a starker picture of his commitment to disciplining and shaping the poor into productive laborers via systems of compulsory work connected to punishment. So what does he devise? Locke proposes that all so-called able-bodied adult males over 14 and under 50 who are caught seeking alms in maritime counties and outside of their own parishes without travel passes be seized. He argues that they shouldn't be sent to houses of correction because he asserts that, quote, those houses are now in most counties complained of to be rather places of ease and preferment to the masters thereof than of correction and reformation to those who are sent thither. Unquote. Instead, he suggests that they be sent to the nearest seaport and compelled to perform hard labor until the next available naval ship comes in and then pressed into naval service. Desertion is to be punished, likely by execution, and he suggests that men who are over 50 or, in his language, maimed, can be sent instead to the houses of correction for stints of hard labor. If it seems as though these offenders are, quote, stubborn and not at all mended by the discipline of the place, unquote, they may be held there for longer and under more harsh discipline until they are judged sufficiently reformed. Women and children caught seeking aid out of parish are given slightly milder punishments, although coercion still figures prominently. If an adult woman is caught, she is to be returned to her parish. If she's caught twice or found wandering too far from home, she is to be sent to a correction house for a 3-month term of hard labor. And children caught begging are to be beaten and then sent to a workhouse to labor until the evening. And if caught again or found too far from their home parishes, they're to be sent for 6 weeks of hard labor in a workhouse. Locke imagines that these punitive measures, if well publicized and consistently enforced, will eliminate, quote, the pretense that people want work, unquote. He speculates that most will think twice before claiming that there is no work to be had, given that the potential public response to begging is compulsory military service, corporal punishment, and hard labor. His recommendations rest on his assumption that the poor are people without credit in multiple senses, and that rather than responding to them as people at risk in an otherwise prosperous society, parish overseers should focus on the risks that they pose, risks rooted in their perceived dishonesty and resistance to norms of productivity. Locke argues that if the existing laws are enforced and some further measures are implemented, England can either eliminate or reduce dramatically the number of the so-called able-bodied poor. And Locke spends much of his proposal focusing on them, but even he admits that they are but a tiny fraction of those who seek poor relief. Most of the poor are, he writes, quote, not absolutely unable, nor wholly unwilling to do anything towards the getting of their livelihoods, yet even those, either through want of fit work provided for them or their unskillfulness in working what might be a public advantage, do little that turns to any account, but live idly upon the parish allowance, or begging, if not worse. Unquote. Among these are women with children, men who cannot labor at full strength, or young children whose parents cannot fully support them. Locke suggests that adults in this category might be put to work part-time to contribute to their own livelihood and to the productivity and wealth of the state. Whatever else they need to cover their most basic needs could then rightfully come out of the public stock. So these adults might be able to negotiate for relief as they once could, but only after meeting a compulsory labor requirement. Locke worries that the children of the poor are also, in his language, maintained in idleness until they turn 14 and are ready to serve as labored apprentices. He figures this as national waste, arguing that working schools could extract the labor of poor children while socializing them into the labor-oriented adults that he valorizes. For parents seeking relief due to an abundance of children, their children can be sent to these schools, which Locke sees as solving several problems at once. Mothers will be able to work outside of the home to support their children, who will require less time and care from them. Fathers will be unable to claim relief on behalf of their children and then use it for base purposes, because it will be public knowledge that their children are partly cared for at these so-called schools. But most importantly, he argues, children will, quote, from their infancy be inured to work, which is of no small consequence to the making of them sober and industrious all their lives after. Unquote. These interlocking proposals form what Locke refers to as the true and proper relief of the poor, which for him cannot be a system of alms initiated and then negotiated by people who self-identify as poor. Instead, he envisions a much more hierarchical system rooted in the valorization of labor, one that, quote, consists in finding work for the poor and taking care that they do not live like drones upon the labor of others. And in order to this end, we find the laws made for the relief of the poor were intended. However, by an ignorance of their intention or a neglect of their due execution, they're turned only to the maintenance of people in idleness without at all examining into the lives, abilities, or industry of those who seek for relief. Unquote. The details of Locke's proposal thus reveal that his goal is to refashion poor relief into a system that enforces the value of work, even if it cannot produce perfectly self-supporting individuals, and even if it produces no national surplus, which we now think in hindsight it never could. As Locke admits, most of those already seeking poor relief will continue to need assistance. For many of these individuals, he makes this aid contingent upon their labor for the commercial, military, and colonial endeavors of the state, done in public workhouses and schools, rudimentary factories, and the Navy. While Locke is convinced that his reforms will generate a more prosperous society by shaping the poor into a more productive class, what he sets up may be closer to what you referred to this morning, Marisa, as production without productivity. That really leaped out towards me as a framework for thinking about what he's doing as well. Moreover, the changes he recommends are costly. Most importantly, they pose significant and unquantifiable costs to the poor themselves. Locke advocates a system in which charity, work, and punishment are administered in combination, one in which the poor cannot function as agents with a full claim on their communities and the state, but are instead turned into objects of knowledge and discipline. As Joyce Appleby comments, the able-bodied poor could be set to work on terms beyond their control, as overseers were constantly pressed to evaluate their physical capacity for work and to turn them towards it. Thus, as she writes, in seeking help from the parish, they lost part of their civil liberties, unquote, which I understand to mean the rights to control their bodies and their labor, and their capacity to participate in a political community premised on free cooperation and trust of the kind that Locke idealizes in his second treatise of government. As James Tully remarks, the aim of Locke's proposal is not to secure better reciprocal relations between the rich and the poor, or really to confront the distress of the impoverished, but, and these are Tully's words, to use the law, the navy, corporal punishment, the threat of divine punishment, economic incentives, and the activity of repetitious labor from age 3 onwards to fabricate an individual who is habituated to obedience and useful labor. Lockean poor relief thus treats the poor as simultaneous objects of benevolence, labor extraction, discipline, and punishment, but never as participants in networks of trust that characterize his theoretical polity. In harnessing these people to a system of work-based relief, he provides daily occupations for their bodies that he thinks might cultivate habits of industry and a normative attachment to labor, and also make them somehow more knowable and less risky. But his normative assessment of the poor and his political recommendations for the management of poverty invites critique in the form of some questions that I'd like to pose in my last bit for today, and this will be quite short. So Locke's treatment of the poor is, for me, generative in 2 senses. First, on an interpretive level, it of course invites us to rethink Locke's commitments to freedom and equality as he articulates them in the second treatise, and to attend more closely to the inequalities and relations of domination that support his body politic, as feminist theorists, disability scholars, critical race theorists, and scholars of indigenous studies have long asked us to. And second, it draws out some pressing dilemmas that are now ours in some way. Locke begins with the question, what is poverty? To frame his effort to disturb micro-practices of the self-identification and agency of the poor in the process of poor relief. Instead, he reconfigures poverty as the gap between the material conditions of poor persons and what they could provide for themselves via their own labor. And from there, he makes an argument for poverty as frequently, if not always, a condition of moral as much as material lack, traceable to an unwillingness to follow the divine injunction to labor. And in so doing, he parses the poor into the able and the unable, the undeserving and the deserving. And although these categories have since become entrenched, in examining their roots, we might find ourselves better able to democratically contest them and to pursue alternative understandings of the causes of poverty and what it means to identify as poor. Locke's work also pushes us to think about the agency or freedom of the poor and how their agency may be enhanced or constrained by political solutions to the problem of poverty. Certainly, Locke's account is striking for its eagerness to limit the agency and movement of poor people. Their freedom of movement is restricted, they may not choose their work, they may not manage their own time, and they are not left to perform care work according to their own wishes or plans. This might compel us to re-examine what Locke was resisting. Social historians have taught us that one of the most striking features of poor relief as it was practiced was that it occasionally created space and opportunity for the poor to define poverty for themselves, to identify their own needs, and to negotiate how to meet those needs in dialogue with others, and to develop relations of reciprocity, if not equality, with other parishioners and magistrates. That is to say, poor relief was at times an avenue for experience in negotiating social, economic, and political membership for the poor, albeit an undesirable avenue opened by deprivation. If we're committed to the democratic agency of all persons, we might evaluate contemporary efforts at ameliorating poverty by thinking more carefully about which ones enhance the agency of the poor to pursue their own paths to self-determination and self-development, and which ones obstruct these paths. Lastly, and relatedly, Locke's emphasis on labor, productivity, and value creation as essential bases for political inclusion and perhaps even personhood on his account are made apparent in his writings on poverty. His moral judgment of the poor and his justification for their domination is grounded entirely in his perception of their resistance to the moral injunction to labor. But his harsh prescriptions invite us to challenge him on this front. Is labor an appropriate criterion for political membership and inclusion? What are the costs of situating it as such? What would it mean to unsettle our own socialized attachments to labor and work in the context of late capitalism? And how would such a move reconfigure and potentially democratize our notions of political membership and belonging? Thanks.
I'm gonna not use the podium, if that's okay. Is this on? Yes, okay. Okay, so my piece is also a part of something that is in progress. It isn't, I'm not in a historical period, I'm in the contemporary period, but I'm also dealing with trying to think about pluralism, democracy, and social movements. Yeah, here we go. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. Social movements are often regarded as potentially hazardous disruptions, uprisings that interfere with the normal mechanisms of politics, insurgencies that must be either repressed or swiftly reincorporated into the regular legislative process. In 2016, 3 years after the emergence of the Movement for Black Lives, President Obama chided the movement by saying that it had been, quote, really effective at bringing attention to problems, but claiming, end quote, quote, once you've highlighted an issue and brought it to people's attention, and elected officials or people who are in a position to start bringing about change are ready to sit down with you, then you can't just keep on yelling at them, end quote. He went on to say, quote, the value of social movements and activism is to get you at the table, to get you in the room, and then to figure out how is the problem to be solved, end quote. Obama's view is a common one, but it is also incorrect. The value of movements is something much more profound. Movements are what keep democracy from falling irrevocably into the pitfalls of bureaucracy and oligarchy described by Max Weber, chiefly dehumanization, expropriation, and stagnation. This is important because democracy is more than the institutional framework that is commonly associated with it. In truth, democracy demands a broad political orientation toward participation and citizenship from the people who are to govern. A democracy where people have come to believe that voting, for example, is the only kind of participation that matters, that their vote in any case doesn't count, that the system is fundamentally rigged, that those who govern are not like them, and worse, are unresponsive, is a polity that will struggle and perhaps fail to bear the burden and responsibility of self-governance. If citizens, from whose authorization the legitimacy of democratic government arises, come to believe that their capacity to act as authors of their collective fate is a fiction, then what follows is what I call a politics of despair. I argue that the force that counteracts the Weberian pitfalls and also the politics of despair, and which, I already said, I ad-libbed and shouldn't have. I argue that the force of that counteracts the Weberian pitfalls of bureaucratization and oligarchy, and which can counteract the politics of despair by repoliticizing public life, is social movements. And that phrase, repoliticizing public life, is one that I take from Iris Young's piece, Justice and the Politics of Difference. Now, movements do so by providing people the ability to engage in the practice of freedom. Social movements infuse the essential elements of pragmatic imagination, social intelligence, and democratic experimentation into public spheres that are ailing and have become non-responsive, stagnant, and/or closed. They are necessary not only to address the concerns of those engaging in public protest, nor only for the ethical purpose of achieving more just conditions for all, but also for the health and survival of democracy as such. Contrary to, and this is where I can't wait to interact with you, Victor, at the end. Contrary to the theoretical balm of balanced pluralism offered by American democratic theorists in the mid-20th century, especially Robert Dahl, social scientists have consistently demonstrated that empirically the heavenly chorus, that is, the collection of voices raised to speak their interests and policy preferences in democracies, sings with a decidedly upper class and white accent. To wit, nothing explains differences in political participation better than socioeconomic stratification. Likewise, elected representatives are most likely to listen to upper class constituents and make policy in accordance with their wishes. Suppositions by mid-20th century political scientists that perhaps stratified participation in electoral politics was voluntary, and therefore a benign expression of disinterest rather than a reflection of structural disadvantage, have been resoundingly proved false. and accompanying equally optimistic notions that perhaps the policy preferences of the upper and lower classes were not very divergent have also shown themselves to be incorrect. Additionally, though socioeconomic status is the most predictive indicator of political participation and influence, race and gender matter most in terms of the way members of the polity understand the political world, as well as how they develop and express political attitudes and policy preferences. These stratifications do not balance out at any point in the electoral process, national or local, during campaigns, or once representatives are situated in office. Instead, our regular electoral process routinely leaves some, usually white upper-class men and associative conglomerations thereof, on top, and others arrayed in an intersectional hierarchy that cascades below. The well-documented stratification evinced in the electoral system means that the United States is, in fact, not hyperbole, governed by and for the benefit of the few, rather than the expansive swath one might imagine with the echo of the words "we the people" ringing in the doxa of our imagined community. This idealized form of the arrangement, right, this pluralist arrangement, which Iris Young calls interest group pluralism, is predicated on the idea that coalitions of interest will be voluntary, based on associative rather than structural or immutable categories, and able to combine in a variety of ways, right? And I really liked what Victor said, that pluralism is about authority. And I think that my critique, one that I'm kind of building on from Iris Young's work, is that indeed pluralism is about authority, but it doesn't acknowledge power. The acknowledgement of difference in pluralism is an underpinning of the idea of democratic pluralism, but the understanding of difference in this conception and its implications for justice and the possibility of a well-functioning democracy is very flawed. The kind of contestation that proponents readily acknowledge as endemic to the political includes competing interests, competing values, competing ethics, competing norms, competing discursive lexicons, etc. And traditional proponents of pluralism, like Dolph, argue that such conflicts can and should be solved through the normal process of institutional politics, because satisfying the demands made in these contests is simply a question of organization on the part of citizens and responsiveness to that organization by officials. Those with competing views in this conception must organize with others who share their perspective, and the most organized interests will win out, with no win ever being permanent and power shifting over time. However, the problem, as we know, is that pluralism is not only characterized by conflict between equals who have differing perspectives, but it is characterized by, fundamentally characterized by, inequality, structural disadvantage, and if not immutable, then demonstrably enduring exclusion based on ascripted characteristics. The issue of inequality is of great concern, not simply, right, and all of that has been said, but what I think Young points us to, and what I really want to build on, is that this issue of inequality is of great concern, not only because it is a matter of different social groups not acquiring the same amount of power, right, or authority, but that inequality compounds over time, giving rise to a cumulative effect or legacy that, while it does not always arise from the actions of the current members of the polity, nevertheless conditions the material opportunities granted in their lives, shaping the political meaning of their social understanding and the effect of their political actions. In short, interest group pluralism might, ideally, be able to solve the problem of difference, but it is only because the concept of difference is so thoroughly misconceived as to leave out considerations of the reality of inequality and its political and economic consequences. But inequality is not the only concern. The most important and pressing concern is that this kind of interest group pluralism tends to depoliticize public life. Because we carry out democratic politics in a way that restricts legitimate political concerns to personal interests, right, under this view, right, or your associational interests, we have developed the habit of making, and this is a quote, no distinction between the assertion of selfish interest or normative claims to justice or right. Indeed, the most common political insults leveled in contemporary politics, that of snowflake or social justice warrior, treat genuine emotional investment in political topics and commitment to the ideal of justice, respectively, as infantile, undesirable, non-rational attributes. Politics is supposed to be made of sterner stuff, namely a naked competition among claims, where the only worthy consideration is winning, and one does not win by persuading a public that one's claim is just, but instead by making trades and alliances with others and making effective strategic calculations about how and to whom to make your claims. This process, quote, collapses normative claims to justice into selfish claims of desire. This way of conducting democratic politics is not damaging merely because it presents ethical problems, but instead because it fosters a political cynicism and convinces people that democratic politics is less about participation, representation, problem solving, and indeed citizenship, and more a great game where the powerful compete and the rest of us clamor through our lives trying to stay out of the dangerous messes that they make. A further concern is that when the goal is only to win and not to deliberate, persuade, problem solve, and reimagine what is right, the range of arguments that circulate in public discourse is narrower and the content more superficial. Iris Young contends that this leads to a fragmented public life in which people only give an audience to the arguments of their group. Today, the media environment, which features cable news subdivided by political attitudes, websites and blogs, precision-tuned for ideological preferences, and social media feeds personally and algorithmically curated to perfect comportment with our pre-existing ideas, this tendency has only grown in intensity. Our discursive environment now provides structural support for public fractionalization. This means that there is no forum within the public sphere of discussion and conflict where people can examine the overall patterns of justice or fairness produced by these processes. Additionally, because the political habit is to evaluate politics based on who's winning and who's losing, right, horse race coverage, rather than what is just or good and for whom, it is exceedingly difficult to bring the, quote, basic structures, assumptions, constraints, and decision-making procedures that coalesce to produce political outcomes into public discussion because, for the most part, these structures are not effectively public, right? They're not legible. The consequence is that political proposals are not directed at, quote, persons as such, but as persons constituted piecemeal, as taxpayers, health service consumers, parents, workers, residents of cities, and so on, end quote. This kind of fragmentary public sphere's most negative impact is not polarization, but instead incoherence. Not only are there a dearth of public forums for discussion of issues outside the rubric of selfish interest or who's winning or losing, even if there were such settings, our political culture has not taught us what we ought to do in them. This kind of depoliticization, more than conflict or polarization, is the death of democracy because it means that the nation has become a mere territory rather than a polity, because people have forgotten how to be citizens. So I have listed the empirical and conceptual, what I view as the empirical and conceptual deficiencies of interest group pluralism, but it is also important to remember that since inequality is structured and difference is a social fact, any way of arranging power that starts from the world as it is, as the world as it exists, will be frustrated in its attempts to attain a just political and social relation. Likewise, there are no ideologies, procedures, or policy agenda that can permanently or entirely undo the material and political consequences of the historically compounded legacies of structured inequality that we live with. Of course, that is not to say we cannot and should not strive to do better. What is required for a political project that can meet the world where it is and to take it someplace new is an ethic for deciding what political remedy looks like and a political culture that facilitates revising structures, laws, and routines so that they can be in comportment with what the polity conceives as just as much as possible in a given time and place. Fundamentally, this is what democracy is built to do. However, since democracy, like all governing systems, develops strong oligarchic tendencies over time, it is necessary to push through periods of political stagnation, and social movements provide the way. In this way, movements are a potential antidote to the politics of despair. They allow us to enact citizenship, not only through performing duties, but by authoring new understandings, priorities, and governing institutions. Unlike other forms of participation, which can also teach valuable civic skills, social movements show us how to make change. Even if we don't immediately change policy or restructure institutions, we change our ideas, we change our minds, we change our associations, we change public understandings, and we change the scope of political possibility. It is important to note that I don't assume that all social movements will be progressive, nor do I think that the political curative of contention is only delivered from the left. Democracy is difficult and risky. It is so because it entrusts people who have divergent understandings of the world and deviating interest in it to govern themselves collectively with no power above them that can right the ship of state should they decide through recklessness, blundering, or honest error to dash it against the shores of history. A democratic society is ever in danger of doing itself in, but democratic polities are also incredibly resilient when they maintain public belief in and commitment to engaged citizenship that relies on debate, persuasion, and participation rather than resentment, cynicism, and violence. That is to say, when the democratic polity remains political. At the point at which belief in the efficacy of politics becomes tenuous in the majority, when people begin to despair, not about the consequences of decisions that they have made, in collective contestation, but instead at the very possibility of governing themselves, then the only hope for repair is the repoliticization of public life through social movements. Because this exercise of citizenship, this exercise of the political, reminds people what it means to be a citizen. And now, so when I say citizen in this sense, this doesn't necessarily mean a legal member of the polity. It means a participating member of the polity, right? One who is part of the governance of ourselves, right? Okay. When anti-democratic movements arise and do this work, it is the responsibility of the citizenry to evaluate and answer. Sometimes, as we learn from the rise of the Third Reich in Europe and the rise of fascisms today, the polity will make catastrophic choices. But at others, it will author principles and construct institutions that bring future generations closer to the ideal of justice. For these reasons, it is important to take social movements seriously as a pragmatic political solution to a real democratic problem. So this is a little bit on the actual repoliticization of the public sphere. And it might be a little disjointed because it's from a different part of the work that I do. Okay, so social movements' greatest good derives from repoliticizing the public sphere, that is, reminding the people that they are the root of all legitimate democratic authority. When they arise, movements disrupt the formation of the bureaucratic iron cage, right, that Max Weber warned us about. In which elites organized into efficient establishments forget that their purpose is to serve the polity and instead spend their energy and resources defending the perpetuation of power and knowledge as it most benefits the artifice of the organization. As such, movements arise within welfare capitalist society on the fringes of bureaucratic institutions or carving out new social spaces not dreamt of in their rules, to exploit and expand the sphere of civil society and challenge the forms of oppression and domination that structure contemporary social and political relations. Okay, so this is a little bit about how I think that the Movement for Black Lives does this. So I think that this is something that all social movements do. They repoliticize public life by reminding both the people who are participating and the polity at large what it means to be involved in political change, what it means to reimagine solutions to problems that you have just named, and to actually be able to enact those imaginations. And the movement for Black Lives, colloquially called Black Lives Matter, does this with a particular political philosophy that I call radical Black feminist pragmatism. And the pragmatic part of it is actually really important. And it's something that I have been hesitant to actually use. But in the same way that I think that social movements writ large are pragmatic, and that's sort of set against or read against utopian, is that they are actually utilizing what people call sort of prefiguration in the moment that they are existing, right? But this prefiguring is not, I don't actually think it's this prefiguring is a bridge, right, from this moment to that moment. It's not a sort of enactment that has no location, no place, no where, right, in my view, on my reading. Okay, so in 2013, the movement for Black Lives arose as the current iteration of the American Black liberation movement. It has inspired new political activism, developed a unique political philosophy, and imagined new horizons for institutional change, and invented new tactics for contestation. Participants report a natal belief in their ability to be authors of the social and political arrangements that will characterize the new century. The movement seeks to take aim at both domination and oppression, that is the restriction on self-development and the restriction on self-determination, by actively trying to imagine and enact a world in which Black people and all people might be free. Indeed, it is hard to overstate the place of freedom in the conception of movement activists. When asked about the ultimate goal of the movement to a person, and I interviewed a lot of people, each activist described a world in which Black people could be free of domination and oppression. Chanel Matthews, the former communications director for Black Lives Matter Global Network based in Oakland, put it this way: the work is about changing people's behavior so that Black people can live free, full lives in this democracy. And we don't have to be afraid. We can parent our children into adulthood and have access to the rights, the resources, and the recognition that we all need to live our best lives. Brittany Cooper, who's a professor of Africana Studies and an activist in the movement, says, being in movement spaces over the last 3 years, the thing that I have noticed being in movement spaces in the last 3 years is that these are some really big dreamers. And I really think that these are folks who are thinking broadly about transformation. They're not reformers. They don't think we can just tweak the system and these things will happen. But it's a real sort of sense that what does it look like? I think the sort of core goal is what do Black people need to live and thrive? And so how can we put structures in place so that Black thriving is actually a political priority, not only Black survival? It's important to note that freedom in this political philosophy, it doesn't bear the same kind of binary as liberal conceptions of freedom, right, freedom and unfreedom, but is more like Neil's conception of freedom as marriage. In this conception, freedom is fundamentally relational and dynamic instead of fixed and absolute. This is because marriage, as I read it, is a term that originates, you guys know this story, right? In the French Caribbean, right, meaning flight, right? And this flight, as I sort of intimated in a conversation or in that question of George earlier, is not the same as fugitivity, right? It's multidimensional and constant, but it does not have the feeling of desperation, but instead does include this idea of world building, right? Of being in flight, not, of flying, right? Not just only of running away, okay? So the movement refers to the ability of agents to have control, or movement in this view, and this is Neil's work, refers to the ability of agents to have control over motion and the intended directions of their action. I think that's really important, right? Because it has this sense of purpose and self-determination that's not the same as someone who's escaping, right, is running away. Okay. Okay. Okay, likewise, thinking about one's control over one's own movement as a measure of freedom, and specifically of flight, as the motion that conveys departure from oppressive conditions, provides another method of assessing degrees of oppression or freedom. Property and purpose are pillars that allow one to assess degrees or relative levels of domination. These degrees of freedom exist not only between people, but also within time. That is, one's freedom is relative, not only to how free others in your political time and place are positioned, but also to how free one is compared to a future desired state. The movement for Black Lives is fundamentally concerned with this kind of temporality, and especially with futurity. Patrisse Cullors puts it this way: I am hopeful for Black futures, and I say that because we live in a society that is so obsessed with Black death. We have images of our death on our TV screen, on our Twitter timeline, on our Facebook timelines, but what if instead we imagined Black life? We imagined Black people living and thriving. That inspires me. Importantly, these ways of understanding freedom as relational and dynamic are more useful and important for understanding what one is actually capable of doing, given the structural constraints of the actually existing world, than rights and choices that one may be formally accorded under law, but which are in practice difficult or impossible to exercise. In this way, freedom as marriage, or something like Sen's capabilities approach to freedom, is ones that attend to the relational basis and dynamic nature of the concept as it is used in the movement, and which is simply and cleverly expressed in the slogan, which is ubiquitous, #GetFree, right? But how, but how can the movement do this? And the movement does this, I think, because it is underpinned by a political philosophy, yes, as I said before, of radical Black feminist pragmatism. And each word in this kind of phrase, it's kind of a long phrase, but each one has sort of significance for how people actually do politics or conduct politics in the movement. Radical is a mode of questioning, is their mode of questioning. Black feminism is an ethical episteme, an ethical system, and Blackness is an episteme. Pragmatism is a mode of judgment that guides action. So this radical Black feminist pragmatism consists of, I think, at least 7 different features, which I can name for you and get into in the question and answer. But I want to pause here and underline this notion of pragmatism, because usually radical and pragmatism don't go together. But I think they very much do in this movement, right? Because the radical, in being the mode of questioning, is all about trying to figure out the root causes, right, of problems, and fully understanding and acknowledging and naming the fact that those root causes are going to be multiple, intersecting, layered, forces that are acting on different people in different ways, but with a commitment to sort of questioning and upending regular understandings of what we can do or what's the matter and what we can do. Okay, but the pragmatism is a mode of judgment that says that we want to make room for ways of acting that are not necessarily direct lines from this moment to revolution, right? It wants to make room for what I've discussed with Yasmin for midnight baking. They want to make room for activities such as in Louisville, Kentucky, the chapter for the Black Lives Matter chapter in Louisville, what they have done is that they buy decrepit houses, fix them up, and then give them away to Black single mothers, right? They think of this as anti-capitalist transformation, right? Explicitly, right? Like that's how it's described. But it's not anti-capitalist in that it's trying to sort of overthrow the system. It's this other kind of register of transformative action and work. And it is pragmatic in that way because it is a material bridge from this moment to a world where Black people can live and thrive. At the same time, it's also not triangulating, so it doesn't have that colloquial feeling of pragmatic. It's not trying to appease authorities or make deals with people who don't have your best interest at heart. Instead, it really is sort of finding these spaces of freedom, right, in a system of unfreedom. And I think that's a really interesting approach, uniquely codified in the movement. Okay, so I guess I'll actually stop there.
So because your moderator failed in the only task moderators really have, which is keeping track of time, I'm going to suggest we take 2 or 3 questions and bundle them because our panel's virtually over. So why don't we bundle a couple and then I'll leave it to you to respond as you will.
This is a lovely panel. I was really excited to hear each of your talks and listening to them in conversation with each other with the mandate that radical acts can be pragmatic, coming from Diva at the end here, just makes me think a lot about the relationship between reform and revolution or abolition. I think pluralism is often deployed as this kind of reformist politics, and like poverty, welfare, social welfare policies often get deployed as such as well. And part of what you were both showcasing were the limits of reform as a progressive political strategy. And I'm just curious if there's a way to, in abolitionist activism, the idea that abolition is a long-term strategy with practical, everyday application is part of what keeps reform as a place of possibility and not as a stuck place, right? And so I'm just wondering if there's ways of thinking about these spaces of reform in radical ways. Like, are there ways of thinking about these kind of pragmatic attenuations to pluralism or to poverty or to inequality in ways that would move them out of this limit space of governance and authority and into a space of possibility or something like that?
Yeah.
Thank you all for this great panel. I had a question for Emily about whether, in your reading of Locke, any, let's say, affective phenomena or concepts emerge in a way that kind of coheres this construction of the poor subject. And one thing that came to mind was that of pity, for example, whether pity functions in any way. And pity is a particularly interesting thing because it can motivate charity in one sense, but it can produce really perverse forms of intervention. And I think, for example, of work on empire by people like David Bromwich and Uday Mehta talking about, Burke, I think, had a sense for what pity could do perversely in the context of empire. So anyway, I was just wondering, it doesn't have to be pity, but whether there are kind of affective concepts that cohere your account of Locke at all.
Just for the question of pragmatism and the radical, I think absolutely, right? But I think that you have to be guided by particular ethics. The thing about pragmatism, philosophical pragmatism, is that it's not, it's a rubric for making judgments. It's not full of principles, right? So you have to have principles. And if your principles are radical, then pragmatism is a perfectly good mode of judgment. The political philosophy of the movement is radical, and it does a bunch of things like sort of invert the way that we regularly think about political philosophy, for example. So I should say that I think that what the movement does in its political philosophy is to value experience, embodiedness, emotion, non-rationality as all critical parts of reasoning, value interdependence over individuality, to center an ethics of a politics of care, which is about centering the most marginalized, and developing policy from the bottom up, right? And also about a restorative, reparative, and transformational forms of justice, right? Which are about, and it's not just, it's a whole like sort of reconception of how you deal with harm, and how you evaluate whether you've been harmed, and a centrality also on the notion of healing as a political act, right? Not as a sort of individual act, but actually something that happens when you are able to act on what Prentice Hemphill calls the sites of shaping, right? So the sites of shaping are these the forces, the institutions of oppression that kind of create trauma for you, or what she says makes trauma live in your body, right? So it's this conception of valuing things differently, of doing philosophy and political principles inductively rather than deductively, meaning from the meaning of experience rather than from the abstract sort of norms that we can come up with in a perfect world. So it's very much operating based on these principles, but within the world as it is, right? And even though the movement has this notion, like most social movements, that another world is possible, it's not as though they're waiting for that other world or devaluing the democratic experimentation and political imagination that it takes to make the bridge from this world to that one, right?
Well, I can take this one. I think that pluralism is, well, first of all, I think that there are different kinds of pluralism and meanings of pluralism, and perhaps part of the what stops the conversation from flowing more clearly between the understanding of pluralism that Diva presents and the one that I present is that they are in fact very, very different spheres. There is a relationship between Robert Dahl's work and, say, Harold Lasky's work. I believe that Dahl studied under Lasky at some point, but where the kind of pluralism you describe aims at influencing the state, and that is, it's different interest groups that aim at shaping the policies of the state. Jurisdictional pluralism is effectively, rather than a voice, it's an exit option. It's just let's create a space in which the democratic authority does not operate as it would operate as it does in general, and not just the democratic authority, but whatever authority happens to be in the hands of the state, which means that the pluralist jurisdiction can be more or less radical depending on what it's being more or less radical against. If you have a moment of general economic and social impasse, the organization of the Roman Catholic Church as the first modern proto-state with a bureaucratic apparatus that can resolve disputes much more efficiently, as in the 12th century, can be quite progressive. When it stands in the way of the liquidity of the state in the 18th century, it can be quite regressive. And likewise, there are many moments where pluralist principles of self-organization and pushing out the majoritarian structure, so the majoritarian decision procedure, has been quite forward. And we can see it, for instance, in the sanctuary movement for immigrants, where you are effectively asserting almost medieval rights to jurisdictional immunity within the church buildings. At the same time, that, yes, I think that your point is very well taken, because although the church and, say, the immigrant movements are trying to influence public policy, the ability, if it is given a robust form and a sufficiently territorially extended form of opting for exit, can be a way of simply saying we've gotten enough. I mean, I think that it would be wonderful if, in fact, the sanctuary cities end up taking many of the undocumented immigrants, make a successful story out of it. Will that effectively mean, especially if we move towards a much more regionalist and states' rights, like a progressive states' rights approach, that the national sphere ceases to be as important as a space for national contestation? I think it very well might. I actually think that's a plausible option, because I think that there's a retrenchment that is quite necessary, and I see the risks on the other side as being much greater. But it is true that if you have the exit option, you don't care that much for voice, except, perhaps within the structure itself.
Thank you so much. Yeah, okay. Thank you for that question. That's very helpful for me. So I'll just say a couple of things in response. First, I think I like that you went to sort of the literature on empire, because I do think it's impossible to read this small policy tract from Locke without situating it, right, in the rise of empire and also the formation of racial capitalism. It is a document of that context. I need to go back and reread it and look for representations of affect and affective phenomena. I don't see much of it in the text from memory. I mean, it is a hard-nosed policy document. I will say that it's not an exceptional document in that regard. Almost all of the policy papers around the poor laws looked an awful lot like what Locke put forward. But your comment about sort of the perverse effects of pity and its connections to practices of alms and charity made me think forward 100 years. So really the Anglophone political economist who breaks that mold is Adam Smith, strangely, right, in Wealth of Nations, right? And he sort of sets aside the two-pronged view of charity that was so entrenched at that time, that either it's made available for people to practice Christian virtue and to achieve their own salvation, or it's a way of constructing some sort of perverse sentimental relationship between rich and poor. And so the sort of embedded story in the Wealth of Nations is one about egalitarianism and luck to some dimension. And it's the text itself's greatest immediate impact was not sort of its intended destruction of the mercantile system, but as a better representation of poverty and a new view on charity. So, but I don't know about sort of what happens in the intervening period. I'm thinking of a few things, but that's a very long answer to your question, which is that I don't think we see much affect in that text, except for maybe disgust, if we think of it as an affective state. Yeah.
George, I'm going to let you throw a bomb out, and then we're going to have to close because we're over time.
Throw it.
There's a lot of resonance to these papers in terms of kind of American political history and arguing about, from Victor's paper to Diva's paper, about what decentralization means as a form of pluralism, because, and you said, well, it all depends what your goals are, as if you could have a radical form of decentralization that would serve radical purposes of social change. But the question I have, I keep thinking of Lincoln debating Stephen Douglas, and whether it's not about what your goals, in other words, Douglas said you can make popular sovereignty local and states can decide to have slaves or not. And Lincoln said, that's not an option. Mm-hmm. It has to be a national standard. You can't decentralize this. And it seems to me that that debate needs to be had again. But the people who argue on behalf of the vitality, your language about social movements sounded so Wolin-esque and Berkeley-esque to me. Vitality, anti-bureaucracy, anti-elites, anti-oligarchy. And I go, that is the language of the states' rights movements that justified overthrowing any attempt at racial liberalism. So I guess I think this is a really muddy thing. I find each of you potentially in positions that you would find very objectionable. Thanks.
I propose that we ponder this over the brief break we have before the next paper.